Hi, this is Mike, and I'm going to give a little presentation on how to replace the engine decking on a StarCruiser Hovercraft. This picture is of the rear decking on my hovercraft before I tore it apart. Some great stuff foam was injected underneath the rotten plywood, caused it to bulge up underneath the engine frame. The engine frame mounts were obviously loose and not really fastened to much of anything. This picture is after everything is torn out, the plywood, the styrofoam, and the engine stringers. It doesn't have to look perfect. We're gluing new stuff in over the top of all this. As long as there's a good surface, a good solid surface for everything to be glued back onto, everything should be okay. Expect to find water in here after you tear everything apart because water soaks into these places. It doesn't evaporate. Even after mine was sitting all winter, it was still soaking wet down in here. For the new stringers, I went to one of the big box local hardware stores and found some 1" by 4" PVC trim pieces. They're plastic and will not rot. And then for the hardware, at my local Ace hardware store, I found all stainless steel hardware. The eye bolts, the carriage bolts, the washers, the nuts, everything. So this should be more or less permanent repair and won't rot again in the future, even after another 20 years. This is the important part. Make sure everything fits before you do any gluing. Make sure that that rear board fits back where it belongs. The front board is up against the seat. What you can do also is put the propeller in the frame. Make sure everything lines up where it's supposed to before you glue anything. You have to make sure that all the surfaces that you're gluing to are going to be dry. When you open this up, it's usually wet and have to let it all dry. You can dry it with hair dryer, towel it off first, whatever, go in there with a hair dryer, dry it off the rest of the way. There's going to be some water that is still in pieces and so forth underneath the duct, but you can't get all of that. As long as the surfaces you're gluing to are dry, that'll work out fine. I think this test fitting stage is the most important. If you get everything glued together and something doesn't fit right, it's a lot harder to tear it apart and redo it. I know because I did that. I glued in the back piece, and when the great stuff expanded, the piece moved forward too far, had to tear it all apart and redo it again. Before you start gluing anything on these plastic 1x4s, make sure to sand the surfaces that you're going to glue with coarse sandpaper, probably 40, 60 grit, something like that, to give it a rough surface for the glue to adhere to. Otherwise, the glue doesn't seem to adhere as well. You start by gluing in the rear piece with great stuff. Make sure you get a good covering underneath the piece of plastic and behind the piece of plastic. The great stuff is going to want to expand and push the piece of plastic forward, so you have to make some type of a contraption or jig, fixture, whatever, to hold it in place while the great stuff is setting up. Once the great stuff is set up on the rear piece, you can remove your fixturing and do a test fit with your engine frame and your front piece. Make sure that it's in the right place before you proceed any further. Once everything test fits good, you can continue on to glue in the front piece. I used Gorilla Glue along the bottom 1" surface of the piece of plastic to glue it to the floor. After I put the front piece into place with the Gorilla Glue, I used an old squirter bottle with some water in to wet it down because Gorilla Glue activates with water. Once the Gorilla Glue has set up, you can follow that up with some fiberglass. You fiberglass the plastic to the seat and to the floor and the side walls. You can also put some fiberglass on the inside to the blue foam floor also for extra strength if you want. While you're fiberglassing the front piece in, you can also add a strip along the front of the rear piece to add some more support to that. Once that's all set, you can add the styrofoam in between the pieces of plastic. I used a sheet of 2" styrofoam, cut pieces to fit. For the bottom layer, I used 3 separate pieces. The top layer, I used 2, went half and half. And this is all glued in by great stuff. After the great stuff set up on all the foam, my foam stuck up a little bit higher than the plastic, so I took a sander, electric sander with very coarse paper in it, and sanded it to the level of the plastic. Be prepared with a good shop vac, good type of vacuum cleaner to pick up all this residue. It really makes a mess. Once the styrofoam was done, I decided to cover it with fiberglass instead of plywood. The fiberglass won't rot, it's resistant to gasoline. Also, when you do your fiberglass, you must use epoxy resin because the other resins will eat into the styrofoam. I cut 2 layers of cloth and laid them in on top of the foam before I wet them out. When the fiberglass was set up, I cleaned up all the edges with a sander and followed up with a coating of smoke gray Rust-Oleum gloss paint. Take care when installing your engine frame. Use the rubber donuts and some washers to shim it back to the proper height so it lines up with your supports that come from the duct. You can use nylon lock nuts or Loctite on the hardware. Do not over tighten it. You're not fastening down a big block V8. You don't want to tear any of the bolts loose from your supports that you just put in. To fasten your battery holder down, you can take a couple strips of fiberglass and fiberglass them down to the surface to give a thicker surface for the screws to bite into. I hope your project goes as good, if not better, than mine, and you have many more years of fun from your StarCruiser Hovercraft.